Um, good morning, everyone that's joined us. We are now live on Facebook as well. So if your colleagues, for whatever reason, cannot log into Zoom, please do ask them to watch us at our Facebook page, bridgeindia.org, and that should be the first post they see. I just put the link in the chat as well. So welcome to the latest in our webinar series from Bridge India. Bridge India is a think tank that's based in London and soon with other offices opening across Europe. We started about a year and a half ago. We're registered as a charity, a non-profit in London, and the aim is to help Europeans and Brits better understand the different nuances of India, whether that's in terms of society, economy, and policy. So over the last few weeks, while we've been in lockdown, we've had a number of policy-orientated seminars. We've done something on the space policy in India, and I note that in the stimulus package from the government the last few days, there's been a lot discussed on the space sector, which is very good news, very heartening news. We've got another seminar coming up on the higher education sector and real estate and a whole range of other sectors. So thank you all for joining us. The format of today will be that I'll ask each of the panelists to give some opening remarks for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll get into a moderated discussion. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat to the panelists, and all attendees can also upvote questions, which means if you like somebody else's question, you can click the thumbs up sign next to it, and higher up the question comes, the more likely it is we'll take it. In past seminars, we've seen that we've had dozens and dozens of questions, so we've realistically only been able to take 3 or 4. Please tweet at us at bridgeindia.org or watch on Facebook. A little bit about our speakers in the order in which I'll ask each one of them to say a few words. First, we have Priyajit. He's the author of The Last Raja of West Pakistan and also the author of Pakistan's Atlantic Attack and Arbitration. He's a geopolitical analyst with a special interest in the Indian subcontinent, and he's from London. Then we have Matthew Henderson, who's a director of Asia Studies at the Henry Jackson Society. He did, if I'm correct, 8 years of Chinese studies in Beijing, in Oxford, and in Cambridge. Then he joined the Foreign Office in Britain in the mid-80s. And since then, he's had a long and distinguished diplomatic career, mainly spent working on East Asia. The last few years, he left the FCO in 2015. He's been increasingly involved in research on the rise of China and that geopolitical context and impact. Next, we have Deep, who's a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. His research and publications focus on international relations, regional security of South Asia, Indian foreign policy, and with a particular emphasis on China. I'm really glad to have him because he's just finished a dissertation on the complex dynamics guiding the Sino-Indian relationship since the middle of the 20th century. I mentioned we did a space seminar a couple of weeks back in 2015-16. Deep was a junior fellow at the Space Security Initiative at Jackson School's International Policy Institute, researching the space security policy of Asian powers, with India in particular. And then we have Ashwin, who's from a venture capital and business background. He's a deep tech VC, so he started his career as a technology entrepreneur and moved into identifying, developing, assessing, and investing in technology companies. To date, he's assessed and invested in software, semiconductor, clean tech, energy storage, med tech, and a whole range of IP-rich engineering companies. He's got a lot of board-level experience in early-stage tech companies and also has worked a lot with different Chinese companies. So he brings a bit more of a investor and business context. So with that in mind, I'm going to now hand over to Priyajit for his opening comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bridge India, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words today. I would like to structure my submission in 2 parts. So I'll start first with obviously COVID and the issues and what we are assuming about China and going forward. I think there are 2 key questions in a post-COVID-19 scenario. One would be, is the credibility of the Chinese authorities, not necessarily the people, as to how they could be entrusted with the handling of various global affairs going forward. So we all understand and we all agree that probably the next century is the Asian century. And when we say of the Asian century, we try to look at the Asian century with the prism of China, as China being the unipolar proposition in the Asian subcontinent, and the key things and the progress and development going forward, everything is benefiting through Beijing. That is the understanding of the Asian century, which I think probably is not the right approach, because we got multiple uh, different blocks inside the Asian continent itself. It is not a coherent piece of entity. But when it comes to the global stage, and we see that the Chinese proposition is for a more room for cooperation, like they talk about, G2, where the China will be given a much broader role in managing global situation, including pandemics like this. So, so there is some bit of disconnect between these two propositions. And the second thing is that post COVID-19, we would see a greater alliance probably between the blocks of the democracies and the other blocks which might emerge in future. So we are where I think we would be morely focused on the Americans and the Indians going forward in the next phase as to how they could overcome and probably try to rewrite or rethink the way the world is going forward. I would say that the financial crunch, I think it will end with COVID, what started in 2008, 2007. In fact, I think one of the watershed moments was the 9/11 attacks as well. So we are living in a 20-year period of how things have moved on in world dynamics. When it comes to India, I think we are one of the very few countries in the world which has actually stood up quite highly to the challenge, because I think probably this is one of the only global crises when we see that the superpowers being absent and they are quite busy in tackling their own challenges. We don't see a EU collective response. We don't see a NATO response or an American response, because they're all very busy managing and controlling the pandemic in their own backyard, as to see. However, when it comes to India, I think we are one of the only countries who have helped out all our surrounding neighbors, which includes evacuation of stranded nationals, to provide supplying medicines, personal protective equipment. Even we have provided testing facilities in Iran where there were not adequate facilities to go forward. Apart from one country, which will come, because I think one of the topic in this conversation is with the Belt and Road Initiative and the issue with the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But saying the India's role, I think, has been really quite outstanding. We do not know exactly how the pandemic will pan out in the Indian subcontinent yet. However, till now, I think the handling in which the numbers certainly indicate that we are quite ahead of the game, hopefully, and we should be able to manage it in a more sustainable way going forward. When it comes to regional cooperation, I think the fundamental principle of India is the democracy which we all live in. And going forward, there might be some challenges, when people say that, supply chains can be moved from China to other countries, including India. We have to remember that India is a democracy, so there will be challenges which we need to overcome in order to achieve this. However, India was probably one of the only countries which negated the Belt and Road Initiative when everybody else was, joining on to the OBOR and the BRI initiative of China. We questioned it on various platforms including the the integrity and the validity of the project itself. And when it comes to CPEC, I've got nothing against the project itself, because we all live in a very integrated subcontinent. We should always work together. If you see, recently there has been a patent waiver by a US pharmaceutical giant on a potential antiretroviral drug which can be used in COVID, and Pakistan, one of the pharmaceutical companies in Pakistan, has been given that exemption license. So there's a lot which we can work together in order to achieve global good. And I think personally that the other regions of Pakistan, like Balochistan, Gilgit-Balochistan, these are the places where the CPEC route runs through. We need to ensure that there is no demographic changes, the people's rights and the economic fruits and the benefits are shared equally amongst them. There is a lot of potential between India, Pakistan, and the neighborhood like Afghanistan and Iran. So I would probably like to address the message from your platform going forward is that, we should cooperate with all our neighbors, including Pakistan. Obviously, there are challenges which we need to overcome, but there is a lot of potential in the region. And I think if we have to live the Asian dream, we need to work together. However, there will be some hiccups going forward, but we need to overcome them in a matured way. And I think India is best poised in this position to go forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. You started off by saying the next century is undoubtedly the Asian century, but we've tended to think of it as a Chinese century, and ended with saying that India is best poised to take some of that place. So a great opening remarks. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and many thanks again to Bridge India for the chance to take part in this extremely timely event. Now, I'm very much impressed by Priyajit's extremely strategic view. I will probably aim down a bit more into tactics, I think, here. I think we are, all of us, confronted with what I see as really rather a polarized approach. Some really quite strident language coming out from America and China now, where I think it's all too easy to say, goodness me, do we really want to get into that kind of binary debate? But the answer is, I believe that in a situation like that, which challenges everything, really, it's not just democracy. I mean, it's basically the basic tenets in which globalization will continue, we hope, as a force of growth. We have to decide, as Madeleine Albright has very wisely recently advised, that we need to think about where our own interests are followed by usefully and safely cooperating with China in particular, and where there are red lines where we have to contest and compete. Now, it's quite obvious that no state, no matter how large, and this I would include Great India and all of that, can do so alone, and therefore there is a need to do that cooperating, of which Prijit spoke so very, very nobly. I think when we're talking about China's ambitions hereafter in that century, that they certainly want to be dominated by China, it's now becoming very clear that they are still very much set on replacing the rules-based order with a new order driven effectively by standards made by China, markets controlled by China, and that when global growth, when it starts again, will continue to come from emerging markets, they still see themselves as seeking to take the lead. But we have to look very, very hard to see what that world would look like, and challenge some of our assumptions about whether we want to be fully integrated in it, part integrated in it, or indeed to resist it. As regards BRI, I think BRI has proved to be an extremely risky strategy for China. When China is confronted by risks that challenge their strategies, they tend to respond with tactics that aren't always particularly finely tuned. I believe that the problems that they will face from debt, the loans that they've made and given out not being repayable, perhaps ever, will result in political pressures, debt leveraging, and disadvantageous deals being put on some of the weaker partners in the BRI construct, and that generally the whole thing will become much more transactional, short-term, and an area where China's risks are managed in a more or less aggressive manner. And obviously, the weaker the state that's concerned, and the more they are involved in the big plans of China, and Pakistan is one in that connection, the more risks there are. So from that point of view, is it in India's interests to take a more actively resistant stance to China? I would say, I think none of us should be in any doubt as to the need to define our interests, as I said earlier, and having done that, to articulate them. But this does not have to be adversative, it doesn't have to be aggressive, and we should not get ourselves involved in this tit-for-tat battle of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. It serves no useful purpose. In terms of India's opportunities in multilateral organizations, I see these as very great. And really that's where I think some of Priyajit's ideas can be implemented very effectively. I think that the Quad Plus concept is a very interesting one. I think at the moment, obviously, quite rightly, it's focused on disaster management, but there is much more to it than that. And that there is a very important way in which India can take a more forward position, can move from hedging effectively into engagement which doesn't involve taking sides, but actually activates constructive relationships to do positive things and to support the rules-based order in a more proactive manner. That the Indo-Pacific provides a wonderful environment for that. As for what China has done well, the trouble with what China's done well is that they leverage it, and we all find ourselves suddenly facing dependencies. I think it's very important that any country, and I'm the last to claim that any of us have got this right, should identify where its dependencies constitute weaknesses and vulnerabilities and endeavor to manage that in a way which is not controversial and not destructive. But we need to think very hard about what Chinese investment means in all of our countries. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment, if I may. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matthew. China versus the US, it's not an either or. That might be, that adversarial way of looking at it is perhaps the wrong one. Let's see what Deep thinks. Deep, over to you.
Deep, I think you're muted.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thanks, Prateek, and thanks for having me. Thank you to Bridge India, and great to be here with the other panelists. I'm going to start a little bit with what has been happening in India over the last week or so in terms of COVID recovery packages and things like that, and then move on essentially to bigger regional and global questions. So for one, as you know, a $26 billion economic package was announced last week in India, and the details of that were laid out by the finance minister over multiple days, which has it's still being analyzed, it's still being understood. But as of now, these announcements, which are multi-layered, complex, and go into a great deal of sector-specific detail, they seem to essentially they're hinged on two basic things. One of them being liquidity-driven steps to increase spending, right? And the other one is to push banks to extend credit and get the economy going once again. The hope is that these will make doing business easy and attractive, both by local and international companies, and that will, in effect, help the economy start about again. Now, along with this, we have also seen some states suspend labor laws, or others we have seen promise to build land banks, and some of these steps, it can be argued, seem precipitated by the conversation about economic decoupling that has been going on between US and China in a post-COVID-19 world. Now, obviously, for the Indian government, the primary priority is to fix the Indian economy, but the question, the larger question still remains: how does the post-COVID world look for China, and in particular, how does it look for China in South Asia, which is more to India's interest? Now, as far as where does China go internationally from here, some form of economic decoupling from the US, from the West, is more or less a given, right? I mean, we have heard President Trump most recently talk about scrapping the US-China trade deal. And if there is some sort of decoupling that does happen, we will see the effect to be borne by what is, at this point, which has been China's flagship foreign policy for the last many years, which Matthew talked about quite a bit, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I'll add a few points to the direction that I think the BRI might take from here on. One of the things that we'll most certainly see in South Asia and beyond after the pandemic recedes, so to speak, would be positive capital, right? And for China, and that might mean having to relook at the various projects that they have undertaken and are at various stages in the BRI in various parts of the world. Now, something called the Health Silk Road has been talked about, has been bandied about by China quite a bit, which China specifically invoked the Health Silk Road in Europe, but it seems similar to what China has been doing in over 100 countries, some form of bringing about medical assistance. And this is something that China might want to continue as a large part of the BRI even after the pandemic. The idea of the Health Silk Road is not new. It's something that was talked about in 2015 and then again in 2017. And this is one way in which China might want to take forward its medical and telecom technologies, find newer markets for them, as well as establish itself as a global health leader. Now, there's something that we need to be also cognizant about. Just as there will be countries that might be keen on signing on to the Health Silk Road, get these newer technologies, make use of Chinese advances in synthetic biology and biotechnology, there would also be a great deal of scrutiny of Chinese capital flowing into various countries. In India's case, we have seen an amendment of FDI rules. We have seen that happen in other countries as well, in Germany, in Australia, in Denmark even. This is something that is going to be here to stay. As far as South Asia is concerned, now China, like in the rest of the world, has found a way of entering South Asia with healthcare assistance, right? And we will possibly see this increase as part of the BRI. This will happen in Bangladesh, in Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and so on. There would also be some forms of loans, like the recent $500 million financial assistance that we have seen that has come Sri Lanka's way, which is unique in the lower rates, as well as a grace period and a longer period through which the loan may be serviced. This is something that China will possibly look at. Now with India, things are going to be more complicated. Now, India is unlikely to join the chorus to make China pay for a number of reasons. For one, the understanding in Delhi is that in a post-COVID world, India is going to need everyone to try and get its economy back on track. As of now, there are a number of various kinds of medical equipment that India is sourcing from China, starting from PPEs and test kits to other equipment. And this is something that is not just COVID specific or pandemic specific. This is something that will continue at least for the near future. But at the same time, as Matthew was talking about, we will see a number of plurilateral settings that will continue to be there. And for example, the Quad Plus with New Zealand, Vietnam, and Korea, that the meetings that we have seen with South Korea. Now, while these do not talk directly about China, it is obviously clear that as time goes on, these kind of meetings on various issues will continue to be there. Now, when we think of what countries are going to do after the pandemic subsides, one interesting question to ask is, do any of the changes that we're seeing in the world today fundamentally change how various specific issues have been between countries? For example, if one looks at the Sino-Indian border issues, where we have seen various clashes or standoffs in the last week or so, do these get affected? No, they don't. In a way, much of the new world that we see after the pandemic is going to be similar to the old world that we are just leaving behind. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to get into any of these points further on in the discussion.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Deep. As you said, that India is in fact quite dependent on China for some of its supply chain, particularly in terms of PPE equipment, test kits, and general COVID assistance. Of course, at least one Chinese company that sells test kits or has sold test kits in India, OneFo, has just recently been banned by the Indian government for saying they've supplied faulty kits, which have between 7% and 61% efficacy against the stated 85, 95%. Ashwin, I want to come to you now. What's your take on it, particularly from a business environment?
You know, one of the things of speaking last is made most of the points, and but clearly I want to pick up two or three threads from Priyajit to Deep, and at times it's so important to look back at what's really happened from a world geopolitical perspective. Gone are the days from a bipolar world to the unipolar world, and now we are truly in a multipolar world. And in this multipolar world, what's happened is you've got Russia and US historically had spheres of influence, and for a variety of reasons, not wanting to go dwell into it, and have sort of given away for a new power to come in. And this is where, like Priyajit said, the rise of the Asian economy, or the rise of the Asian century, China has asserted itself, and its assertion is, in fact, very deep-rooted in economy. And if you trace back to the Ming and the Han Dynasty, when the original Silk Road and the Han Dynasty happened, it was all about trade and commerce and economy, and that's where the focus of China is. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a great assertive role of China to say, hey, we are here on the world stage now. We are going to occupy the space left by United States and Russia, not just from a military perspective or providing a technology perspective, but in terms of the economy and alternative to economic theory as well. BRI is one such great plank that Chinese are using very assertively and boldly. Sometimes this new Silk Road, which we call, it doesn't just look at the westward, it also looks eastward. It starts from Indonesia and Malaysia right through to connecting to Europe, and this is where the biggest value is going to be, because what China is fundamentally trying to do is look at its economy. If you look at its biggest trade partner is America, and it's fraught with a lot of issues on multiple fronts. And I think Pratik, you and I were there probably in the session with Mukund Rajan a few months back, and certainly I was speaking to his brother Raghuram Rajan. He said, you know what, Donald Trump and America are trying to ride a tiger, and when you're riding a tiger, there's no you need to know when to get off, and when to get off in such a manner that it doesn't hurt anybody. And to put just numbers to context, there are 60 countries, that is 2/3 the size of the world population, have signed up to BRI initiative. And we are talking about roughly 200 billion worth of monies that already been spent. And if COVID had not happened, that would have gone to about 1.5 trillion by 2027, according to Morgan Stanley, as one of the estimates. And what is China trying to do? China trying to do is de-risk its own economy. Fundamentally, it's trying to do this to a stage wherein it became the manufacturing base of the world, or the workshop of the world. Once you've got the manufacturing workshops, your standard of living increases. As a result of that, the lifestyle increases. But most economies have got caught in this middle income trap, wherein it's great to have one thing, but you need to now move on to doing high value and products and high value services. And that is where China needs to evolve. It needs a market, it needs a trusted ally, and can it push products to Africa, Central Asia, and also de-risk its own base by building relationships both on the supply chain side and the demand side in Far East Asia, and it's managed to do it well until recently, wherein Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, when he came on the scene, he said, this doesn't make any sense from an economic standpoint. Whilst China is willing to fund all these infrastructural projects, somebody at some point in time needs to repay the loans. How are they going to repay the loans? I'm told Sri Lanka is facing similar conundrum, having taken a lot of Chinese money to develop. In fact, Malaysia took a bold step by cancelling the project, and it felt, paying penalties are much better than actually taking on the debt that China is putting in. But that from an economic context, but from a context of what will happen post-COVID. Clearly, two themes are coming up. The one is supply chain security. The whole world looked at China for getting PPE kits and test kits, whatnot, and for a variety of reasons, they just couldn't get the quality right, or they just couldn't get the custom clearance. Supply chain security has become a very strong theme in the last couple of months. Every country will have to look into its own self. Can India play a role? India could play a role, but it's certainly not ready at this point in time. And it's not ready at this point in time for two fundamental reasons. The tax structure itself in India is so complex that a foreign investor coming in, putting money in, and taking money out when profits arise is very complex. And the second aspect of that is, there's money in India. It's not that there's no money in India. There are rich businessmen in India. There are investors in India who want to take the risk and hopefully reward from that risk. But again, there's no structures or transparencies in terms of how the investment landscape would evolve, and there's this greater threat of IT raids, and profit itself has been seen as in a wrong terminology. What's wrong in making profit? As long as it's transparent and taxes are being paid. So can India really benefit out of this post-COVID supply chain insecurity that they're feeling with the might of China? I don't think so. We are ready yet. We've got there's a lot of positives going for India in terms of subtle factors of helping our neighbors, helping the kinder side or the subtle side of positioning is all great. But at the end of the day, economies and countries need handholding, and I don't think so. Indian economy is strong enough to pump that level of money to handle neighbors or any other parts of the world. We need to focus on strengthening our own economy first. And as I said, the middle income trap, we need to evolve from the services trap that our economy has been trapped into turn that into value-added manufacturing base. There are certain areas that we can do, be it space sector. There are things like materials, pharmaceutical space. We can play a bigger role, but by and large, India needs to figure out where the priorities for the next 10, 15 years are going to be in terms of nation building. And like democracy, there'll be a government in power today, government in power later on, federal structures. But if there is that transparency in lawmaking and transparency in vision of what needs to be done to strengthen Indian economy, then I think India will be in a position to take a stronger footstep and make it truly the Asian economy, wherein it's not just China, it's India as well, and it is the multipolar world. And I'll stop by saying, if people have not read the book by Samuel P. Huntington about the clashes of civilization, I would urge you to read that. And in that, there's a narrative of the New World Order and how multiple countries have to come together to create this New World Order. I think the timing is primed for that. China is there, no matter what bashing people do. The wealth of economy that China has, it will, and it's pumped in so much money in, it is so hard for it to pull back. And there's a cooperative way of working with China, for be it US or be it India. I think there's a way forward wherein you can jointly achieve this goal. There's no need for China bashing at this point in time at all. I'll leave you with that point.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashwin. Quick note for you, Ashwin. One of the attendees, R.D. Jani, has said, "What was the book called again, Ashwin?" So if you can type in the answer to all the attendees and panelists. We're starting to get some questions through. So thank you, Major General Rajiv Narayan. You said, "I don't think India is now dependent on Chinese PPE. That's personal protective equipment." Gautam from Berlin says, "Guten Morgen aus Berlin," and good morning to you too. I want to take a couple of questions together. We've had something from Zara and from Jasmine, and Ignatius coming through as well. So just, I'll take those specifically, but just before that, I have a question for you, Matthew. The Munich Security Conference last year, earlier this year, it was on the theme of Westlessness, which is a widespread feeling of uneasiness or restlessness in the face of increased uncertainty about why the West exists, this kind of liberal order, especially in the context of multipolar worlds, in the context of President Trump riding a wave of economic nationalism, in the context of Brexit. And that was the chosen theme of the Munich Security Conference. Is the West now so divided? If we think about the West's response to COVID, is the West so divided that actually the rise of China as an alternative way of seeing the world, an alternative way of managing the world with its own ethics, its own framework, is it inevitable that China will rise, not because of a push from China, but just a pull back from the rest of the West?
This is a very profound question, and of course it is made up of many moving parts. To talk about the West itself, of course, while I think there remains a very strong feeling about the value of liberal Western democratic processes and ideas, the free market, freedom of navigation, and so on, as embodied by multilateral structures. The problem is that for quite a period of time now, growth has been so low that we are unable to stand up very effectively in the face of a country that comes along and says, look, we do things differently. And actually now, we are your biggest trading partner. That I believe to be true of nearly all the Indo-Pacific countries, that China is the biggest trading partner. So following the money in that way, there seems to be some kind of disconnect between what it was all supposed to achieve and what actually is going on. And that is a challenge that the Chinese are making great use of, even now when their own economy faces enormous impacts and their ability to deliver on a lot of their weaponization of money in the future may be much less than they would like. But nonetheless, there remains that standoff between following the money and following the ideals. We must now realize that actually the way that the Chinese road leads doesn't just challenge the ideals, it actually challenges the world economy, and it makes globalization with Chinese characteristics look like something very much less attractive than it seemed from a more bien-pensant point of view, when we all thought that China would go democratic the richer it got. It didn't, and it won't. And something like that has to be reconciled. It's a huge challenge.
In a sense, this rise of economic nationalism across the world and a move from left liberal leaders to more the center right has actually meant that a lot of countries in the West have embraced a bit more of the Chinese model, in the sense that they're much stronger leaders, whether that's Trump, whether that's Modi, whether that's even in Britain. Deep, I want to just come to you and just post you a quote from Kanti Bajpai, who is a professor and Wilmar Chair of Asian Studies and the director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. He wrote an article in the Times of India a couple of days back where he said, "It is fanciful to think that India can take advantage of the opportunity that may exist with China's downturn and any desires of investors to move out. If those investors go anywhere, it is to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. In any case, China has gone back to work and has the economic and governance strengths India cannot match. The Chinese economy could well come back stronger, given that other major economies are floundering." What's your response to this?
Right. And in fact, along with this, I'm going to, if that's okay with you, I'm going to quickly couple this with another question that I saw popping up in the question and answer box, which basically talks about if the measures that have been taken, how they improve India's chances, right? Now here's the thing. For one, when we talk about and this is something Ashwin was touching upon as well. When we talk about whether the stimulus package that has been announced, or whether the abolishing of labor laws in some states, all labor laws, in some states, some labor laws that have been done, whether these or some states talking about creating land banks. Now whether or not these are going to help India take away from the assumed movement of supply chains from China, right? Now, for one, there are some questions about the countries that are for companies that are actually going to be able to move these supply chains, right? Many of these companies, they operate on a 2 to 3 year margin, right? So right now they're thinking of what they're going to do 2 to 3 years from now. So one part of it is that. Second part of it is we've heard President Trump talk about taking punitive action against companies that move out their supply chains from China, but go elsewhere and not to the US, right? So these are some of the moving parts that are in play. Now, let's assume that all of this still works out, all of this still falls into place for India to take advantage. The biggest questions that still remain for India are, as Matthew mentioned, or I think Ashwin mentioned, taxation, but also land, right? Land is a huge, is an issue that we have seen time and again come in the way of investment in India, because getting a large parcel of land in India in a timely manner is not something that has easily happened. So that's one thing that I think we need to keep in mind. Another part of it is when we see these labor laws, being rolled back, what companies would also want to know is there a possibility that the courts or someone else can roll this back? Is there going to be retroactive action like we've seen in the case of Vodafone in India, right? So there are these uncertainties that have to first fall in place before India can in any way take advantage of newer economic opportunities that might eventually open up.
Pratik, just as a comment to add on to what Deep said, land is an issue, but private sector companies, they're more than happy to pay market price to get the land if there is that land bank available. What's happened historically is governments, whether you call it in the name of SEZs, special economic zones, or industrial zone, government have created land banks. But the problem with that banks is it's been owned by what I call as jugadu businessmen, when we're not really building anything or creating value in that land, but they're just sitting on land banks. And then all that government needs to do is bring in the legislation. If the land's not being used for industrial purposes for 3 years or 5 years, as per the business plan that they have to put together to procure that land, then the land falls back to the government default. If they do, there'll be much more opening up. The private sector are more than happy to pay for the land. The issue is slightly more than that. The issue is how to break this conundrum of land mafia with government and yet bring private sector companies from an Indian context. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is not every country or every economy can say, hey, I'll go out and grow in multiple directions. You need to have focus. See, a great example is China did focus on semiconductor industry back in time, in the 90s, the early 90s. It said, you know what, Silicon Valley has grown because of electronics and chips being done. Why shouldn't China be a manufacturing hub of those chipsets or display sets? And they took that strategic approach and made those strategic investments. Today, China is a default flag bearer for semiconductor industry. That is what's concerning a number of analysts when they talk about, China has got Huawei's best 5G technology. They'll put through all this security measures, and then they can start snooping around. It's actually, there might be some elements to it, but you can put measures in place to check that. But the fundamental thing is they have looked at certain sectors of growth and they've tried to monopolize it. So from an Indian context, you need to really focus where your growth sectors are going to be for the next 15, 20 years and map out a transparent vision. And that should be based on scientific parameters, not by just saying one government comes in, another government goes out and saying, I'm announcing a new policy when it's a rehash of the same. So we need to get our priorities. Somewhere, I think, the priority dilution has happened from an Indian context. India's growth is despite the government initiative. India's growth has happened by entrepreneurial culture. So for us to grow further and become that player, we need to increase that entrepreneurial culture by bringing transparency for long-term vision. And until that's done, it's all great, but it's not coming across. It comes across as very confused message.
Okay, a few more comments coming through. Ranu Das says in the chat, entirely agree with Kanti Bajpai. in a 2014 One Belt, One Road conference that he went to, there were no invitees from Pakistan, and at the time, China really wanted India to engage. Unfortunately, India has not engaged as much from that time. Priyojit, can I come back to you now? There's 2 or 3 questions from Gautam and from others that it's probably worth you picking up. The first one from Gautam is, you've made a great point about India watching out for different South Asian regions like Balochistan. How much leverage does India really have there in terms of both civil society, people to people, as well as intelligence outreach?
Thank you very much, Pratik. It's an excellent question. And I think when it comes to leverage, it has to be a channel through the nation states because Balochistan and Gilgit and all the other parts of Pakistan are administered by the central federal government. What we could do is something which we can definitely work on. And I think one of the steps which the Indian government has recently done, which is quite popular in the news these days, claiming the lands of Gilgit-Balochistan, and which is part of the Kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, which has been integrated with India since 1947 after the first Indo-Pak War. What we could do also is we could help the people there raise awareness, help them with medical supplies, help them. Maybe, we have done a great initiative in Bangladesh where we have doctors over, like what we're doing now, or webinar seminars. India, I think nobody asks India to step into this greater role of, providing the vaccine potential for the virus. But I think in the future we will see probably the vaccine for the COVID-19 will come out of India as a mass production. So I think the deal here is that to India and outside and help all these people whom we think that they are in distress. I think we have to take a measured and balanced approach. We have to always remember that in all the neighboring countries, be it Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even Pakistan, they're all connected with the inseparable umbilical cord to the motherland, and we are all the same people. We might have minor differences, but we need to overcome them when we come to a situation of a planetary pandemic, and these are terrible times we are living through. So we should definitely work together and achieve this. However, we saying that we cannot sponsor and support, the terrorism as an act of straight policy. Thank you.
A few more questions coming now. Raji Pillai asks, given the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief context for the origin of the Quad and the current Quad Plus engagement on COVID-19 issues, do you think, and Matthew, I'll pose that question to you, do you think Quad Plus will emerge as a major strategic platform in the coming years? And where does Europe and where does the UK stand in this kind of arrangement?
Again, an excellent question. It seems to me that we are now confronted with the necessity to look again at all of these multilateral and regional structures and to work out where they can be activated. ASEAN has been what it has been for quite a long time. The Quad has been a very interesting notion, which has had all sorts of geostrategic aspects that have remained latent, it seems to me. Activating these processes and finding out how they can be turned into something that takes theory into practice is an opportunity now that we face, and we must take it, it seems to me. There is so much that can be done to move that family of nations into space that is proactive, that exercises, as it were, a gravitational force in what has otherwise become essentially a series of vacuums, whether it be in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the areas around the Gulf, areas where India has traditionally enjoyed tremendous influence and can again, I believe, exert that in an entirely benign way. And that's why it's so good to see the notion of the sea space, the maritime space off the coast of Africa being somewhere where India can once again play a very, very important part. This is a question of bringing the pieces together, having a game plan, thinking strategically, geostrategically about the sort of world we all want to be part of. And rather than holding back, as it has been so easy to do, Britain essentially defining itself as something that is no longer in Europe. We all need to be part of that world where we feel our own interests and the interests of humanity are best protected. And that means practical engagement, galvanizing these processes, talking to the Australians, talking to the New Zealanders, talking to, as somebody said, the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese now, having managed that tension between standing up to China and not doing so very, very well, it's becoming more difficult for them. And that's because we are not really able to support them. And we haven't even mentioned Taiwan in all of this. There is a huge challenge to us in simply thinking about what is that parameter, that paradigm of democracy and freedom expressed by the existence of Taiwan. How well served is that by multilateral processes? We need to revisit those questions urgently.
Just following on from that, just picking up on a couple of things that Matthew said. He talked about the fact that India can exert influence in a benign way, much more in some of these areas where there has been a series of vacuums left. From your time in Washington and the US, to what extent, what's the view you think from Washington in terms of, does Washington think India and Delhi can step into some of these vacuums? Is Washington actively trying to help India do that as a counterweight to China, or is there a long way to go still in facilitating that?
Right. Thanks for that, Pratik. So for quite some years now, there has been a bipartisan agreement on the directions or the extent to which the US-India relationship can advance as far as Washington is concerned, right? And I don't see there being any change in that per se. The problem is not with that. The question, however, is the extent to which India is comfortable in reaching out into filling out these vacuums left by China, whether they are in the economic space or in the strategic space, right? Because when you look back into India's foreign policy history, independent India's foreign policy history, whether you choose to call it non-alignment or whether you choose to call it multi-alignment, India has always, in a way, preferred not to put all its eggs in one basket. So on one hand, while you see India recently joining over 60 other countries and asking for an impartial inquiry into figuring out the genesis of the COVID-19 virus, at the same time, we also will not see India join the chorus of punishing China for its obfuscation or misdirection in the early parts of this virus spreading across the world, right? So I think that is something that is very interesting and important to see. So to more directly answer your question, will India be interested in filling out some of these vacuums? Yes, but primarily to fulfill the purposes that it wants to fulfill in its own strategic imperatives, right? This is not something that will happen because necessarily because the US or a certain group of countries think that this needs to be done, or that there is a vacuum where India fits in very well. If this happens, it will happen largely because India feels that it has the wherewithal to get into this space without changing too many things about what it thinks are in its own interest.
Matthew, on just staying on this US and China point, in terms of multilateral organizations, the way the US and China have built influence using money abroad is very, very different. The US is comfortable historically with giving out grants and building influence that way. China has been building influence through loans, through BRI. I think Ashwin mentioned a figure of 200 billion that's already been spent. If the US backtracks from WHO, from other multilateral organizations, do you see China stepping in neatly into those roles, or is the nature of engagement that China has is quite different? Because I feel that from what little I know, China's relationship with the money going abroad is very different from that of the US. There's a difference of an inherent kind of look at soft power that the US has, whereas China is maybe more directly ROI focused. Any comments on that from you?
This is a fundamental point. If you look at something like the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the way in which that operates, what you see is that a grant is made, and very often the host country is expected to match that grant to some extent. High standards are expected, and the success of that project will determine the success of future grants made to those countries. And this model is a very successful one because it gives trust, it gives people a chance to prove themselves, and it gives people a chance to benefit enormously in the future. Unfortunately, the Chinese strategy is very different. China looks for weakness. It looks for regimes that need propping up. It looks for leadership which is venal, and it provides incentives to do something cheaper, quicker, and rougher, very often to rather poor standards. You look at some of the dams that have been built, some of the roads and so on, particularly in South America, where you've got innumerable examples of very badly built dams that are now an enormous albatross around an economy, particularly Ecuador. And the result of that is that you end up, instead of creating a better, more robust economy in the target country, you end up bringing countries back into dependency on selling resources, which is what China is essentially wanting for these long logistic chains, and the supportive regimes, as we've seen in Venezuela, which are, as I say, dysfunctional essentially, and that's absolutely fine as long as the deal keeps on working. So two very different standards, moral standards actually, for the use of wealth, and the dependencies that are created by the donation of or the granting of that wealth. Something we need to be very much aware of, and BRI will, I think the stresses faced by BRI post-COVID-19 will probably accentuate that discrepancy rather than bring the two ideas closer together.
Okay, we've got 2 or 3 minutes to go. I want to just go back to Ashwin on the economy very briefly, and then I'm going to come to each one of you for just 30-second summaries. So this has been quite a wide-ranging discussion, I think similar to a lot of the earlier Bridge India sessions we've had, where we've had a combination of people interested in policy, as well as business, as well as civil society. And today I can see the attendees are from India, from the US, sorry, not the US, UK, there's some from Spain and elsewhere in Europe as well. Ashwin, we had a question from Shiju Varghese earlier, that the Indian government has announced a stimulus package of about 10% of GDP. We can haggle over whether that's really 10% or whether that's a bit lower, but the point is it's a fundamental injection into the economy. Will this help? Will this shift the needle in some way, do you think, in terms of making India more attractive for some companies leaving China and coming to the UK? In particular, I'm thinking about some of the labor reforms in UP and Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh. I'm thinking about some of the more business-friendly policies that the package has introduced.
The other day I was reading a very interesting quote by the Federation of MSMEs, and according to their president, the package is frivolous. It's their quote, not mine. But my own take is packages are all fine. I think it's all about trying to come out of this current conundrum that we are in. But I keep coming back to my original thesis. If you want to be an alternative destination area on a long-term basis, you need to get your fundamentals right. And that fundamentals, I can't see that yet. Make in India was a great eye-capturing and rallying force, but in reality, Make in India is not really taken off from whatever I've been told. So I think we should defocus from big shebang messages on Make in India, whatnots, and focus on fundamentals. Go back to like what Deep said back in time and all. People are still afraid, is there retrospective tax coming in? Why is profiteering wrong? So you need to go back to the fundamentals. My own take is the packages will make a very little impact on the grand scale of what India wants to achieve.
We've got a couple of comments on the non-alignment point that Deep made a bit earlier. Kayar Raghavan says, should India align itself on issues with the US and others, and as far as possible marginalize China? So that goes a little bit against, I think, the historical policy of non-alignment or multi-alignment that India has had. So just a quick 20 or 30 seconds from each one of you in terms of summary, and then we'll wrap up. So first, Priyajit, then Matthew, Deep, and then Ashwin.
I would like to summarize saying that I think the previous centuries has been capital tech, tech China, things like that. I think the next at least 20, 30 years going forward, what India needs to focus is the human tech, what we are really good at. We are very good at, in this crisis, we are providing probably the best possible cure, not only for us, but the entire world community, in a form of vaccine or in a form of medication, in a form of any kit. So I think this is something which we really need to focus on. And I'll just quickly make a comment, like there was something discussed about, like a strong man in politics. I would like to say that it is not necessarily that if you have a strong man in politics, doesn't mean that you compromise on your democratic rights as well. So there's a bit of difference between how democracies work with strong leaders compared to the Chinese model. And the more the Chinese act like they are doing, I think the rest of the world will realize what they are going into. I would keep it at that. Thank you.
For myself, if I may, I think it's very important to resist a very tempting and easy solution, which is to say we should align more with the Americans and against China. But this would be a grave mistake, and it risks creating a tension that is potentially geostrategically very dangerous. What we're really talking about is what kind of globalization do we want? Do we really believe in globalization of a sort that is win-win, not in the way that it was used at Davos by Xi Jinping, where both the winners are China, but in the way where we all benefit? And that we can do by restoring and reviving the world order based on rules, and based on the observation of those rules. And all institutions and all systems which promote that are the ones we should align ourselves with and work to strengthen now. Thank you.
Right. So I think much of the new world that we inherit after COVID-19 is will be similar to the world that we are leaving behind now, right? For one, the world will pretty significantly be multilateral. What we will see definitely are a large number of more formal and informal stages in which various countries will interact on various issues at various times, right? And for countries like India, the question therefore would be that in this brave new world, what would security mean? Would it continue to invest only in measures of hard security like military hardware and so on, or how would it reconcile with the newer issues of human security, healthcare, and so on? That is going to make the crucial difference. Thank you.
I would sort of summarize it saying it's not either or. India and China have to work together. And it's not just economic security, but also physical security. India, China, two large neighbors. You can't afford to have discrepancies and not proper understanding. And China has shown the way in terms of it wants to put its economy first, and it's shown a way of actually trying to sort out its conflict with putting economy in the forefront of it. There's an opportunity for India and China to work. I'll come back to taking example of Huawei. Huawei has got the best 5G tech, whether we like it or not, no matter what the US has to say. I think from an India context, India will benefit working with China in the tech space and trying to further its economy and through that further its geopolitical positioning as well. There's no need for China bashing in India at all, and I think I agree with Matthew in that sort of context.
Thank you, everyone. A lot of questions coming through on the chat as well, and some that have come directly to me. We won't get a chance to answer all of them, but the Facebook Live link is there. So if you want to continue this discussion, please just copy and paste your question on that Facebook Live group, and hopefully one of the other people watching it can answer that. So apologies to Tamal, to Mujib, to Atul, Jamil, and a few other people, Ignatius and others, whose questions we haven't quite managed to get to. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. This has been a really, really interesting and very wide-ranging discussion. We in terms of next steps from this seminar, we will continue to have similar discussions, but we have a wide range of views that are shared. Both the view from London, the view from Delhi, and from Washington. I think that's very much the sweet spot that Bridge India tries to sit in. Please continue the conversation with us on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. This recording will stay live on Facebook, as I mentioned. Please do come to our next couple of seminars. The next one we have next week, you can see it on our website, is London has been a big magnet for real estate investment from India. That will obviously change very significantly over the coming months. How will that change? We're focusing on Indian real estate investment into London. The session after that, which is in the first week of June, we're looking at whether Indian higher education has moved towards a more remote learning and edtech driven model. And we'll also have a couple of follow-ups in terms of the space sector in India, particularly looking at the reforms and the new initiatives the government has introduced just in the last few days. I think it was in the third of the 4 or 5 packages from Nirmala Sitharaman that included the space initiatives. Thank you all very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.